We got
Man, I didn't even do that on purpose, and it looked really cool.
We nailed it.
We ended up looking at wins we could get throughout whatever we were doing and prioritizing things as they made sense. We knew that we were going to move from essentially the frame to the roll cage and then pick up things where it worked, and the rear axle was definitely the next thing in the process we had realized. This is a triangulated 4-link rear suspension, and the rear axle is going to have a truss system and new bracketry. So the one that we got from Dynatrac had bracketry for stock axles, and so they needed to be cut off, and then the axle needed to be ground flat. It's always a bit of a process, and you don't want to take off too much, but at the same time you want to make it nice and smooth, so it just takes time. Yeah, Angel's always great. He's a very handy young man and put a bunch of time into that. We both did, and kind of took turns doing things as he was helping Kyle with some other stuff around the shop, but he always does a good job. The rear access hatch I was trying to knock out in anticipation of getting it done prior to the rear inner fenders. We were thinking that we wanted to use that in conjunction with like placement, using it as some landmarks.
We got
Man, I didn't even do that on purpose, and it looked really cool.
It was a pretty straightforward process. The frame needed some small welds to get it together and structurally sound. We were able to get that cut and placed, and then it all went pretty much according to plan. After that, I got into thinking that as we moved forward with things, we were going to be using the kit that we got for the rear inner fenders. That's supposed to work with this particular Jeep, with the roll cage kit, with the rear frame chop, and that's where we ran into a little bit of a snafu. Yeah, it didn't work with the way that the cage system is lined out, so those products are not necessarily compatible from what we understand. We had some communication with Motobilt. They had recommended that if we were going to use the back half frame kit and the cage kit, that maybe we do something custom on the back end. So that'll be something we'll get into a little bit later on. It'll involve the placement of the rear inner shock fenders. We'll get those in, be able to move forward with some sheet metal work in the back. As far as the cage, the basis for it is that foundation we talked about. So it does have landing points that are pretty easily identifiable on the Jeep. You can place these landing kits, and it basically works as a sandwich plate type operation. We had them placed throughout the Jeep, and we kind of started with the dash. There's a magnesium structure in the dash that you kind of have to chop away at. It's not always the most beautiful thing on the inside, but the illustration on the Motobilt directions isn't necessarily the most beautiful either, so we knew we were doing okay. You got to clearance some things in there which isn't out of the norm. You got to be a little bit careful because it is magnesium.
So what it appears
is that ends up like that. We drill through there, that captures, and then this gets trimmed. Once you get the front A-pillar mounts established in conjunction with the dash, then you can move on to the B, C, and D pillar mounts. Those all locate pretty straightforward as long as everything's clamped and drilled accordingly. When it came to the D pillar mounts, we did want those in the correct position and make sure they were leveled, and then we wanted those welded in nice, so we just took some time there. We took quite a bit of time to get all the tubes laid out on a pallet, make sure that we had everything that we needed before we started. We were using a tube polisher and the belt sander feature on the Ameribraid to get that thing all prepped inside and out. Everything is coped nicely, but you want to make sure that there's no any contaminants or scale on the tubes. So Angel did a good job on that. There is a continuous, well, it looks continuous, the A to D pillar on the driver and passenger side that everything else kind of bases itself off of, but it's actually 3 pieces that get spliced together using a process referred to as a rosette weld. So you do the rosette splice with a slug in between 2 tubes. It slides directly in between those. So if you have an 1 3/4 tube, that's 120 wall, and another 1 3/4 tube that's 120 wall. If you get a 1/2 inch tube on the inside, then those can be slugged together, and then there's holes. They need rosette welds, and then weld all the way around, and everything ground flush so that you have that nice, clean, continuous look. I'm assuming that that's a feature that happens with a lot of these cage kits for packaging and shipping purposes. It's a very strong system. It's also met right pretty much at the B pillar that comes up from the Jeep, so it is a good way to do it. It just takes a little bit of time. We knew that we were doing the Motobilt B-pillar delete, but it's a removable system and can be put back on. Before we started the build process, the guys had done a bunch of the removal of things and disassembly. And so with a B-pillar chop, it's meant for the half doors, but in the wintertime or you get cold, you want to put full doors back on with maybe the hard top, and you need that stock B-pillar back in place. So that'll be for sure in a future episode. We needed that to cup nicely to that A to D pillar. So I thought it on that same front as fitting the rosette splice. If we use a 2-inch 120 wall tube up against an 1 3/4 tube, then it cups it nicely. So my plan was to use a section of half of a 2-inch tube up against the 1 3/4 tube, and then weld that into the top of the B pillar, and then grind that smooth so it looks like it's cupping perfectly. So it's just something that we kind of had to pump the brakes on in terms of the rest of the cage, so that we could make sure that that B pillar delete was going to be able to be reinstalled at the exact portion that it needs to, so that both the front door and the back door get gapped appropriately and it looks like it should. As far as the assembly of the rest of the cage, it does go pretty straightforward as long as you're taking the time to ensure that we have things that are placed appropriately, that everything is as square and true as it can be.
I just wanted to go over the proper way to do tube construction, regardless of whether it's a kit or it's something that you're fabricating. Something you should be doing if you're putting one of these kits together, if you get some flat stock. So this is aluminum bar that came from like the remnant section of your local metal supply store. They're machined flat, so they should be pretty good to go. So what you can do when you're putting these together is we have a B-pillar cross-section tube that's running this way that's already been located and it's tacked in place. So when you're locating tubes off of a tube that's already existing, you want them to be on plane. So there's a notch in the tube that goes into the other tube, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's centered on the tube that it's being located to. So you can do that by having a piece of flat stock like that clamped from the tube that you're locating from to the tube that you're locating to. And if you weld those together and there's no rock in this, like you can hear that right now, that's not what we want. What that does is it creates an opportunity under extreme forces for there to be a shear point where things are not centered. I thought it'd be a cool opportunity to show it. So if we take these clamps and we go from the bottom up, because we have this swivel joint, and then we go from the bottom up again on the tube we're welding to, the fact that this piece of aluminum stock is machined flat will prevent the rock, meaning that this tube and this tube are centered and aligned perfect together. So the front is not tacked in yet, but it should be good in serving the purpose that now we have these 3 tubes, minus the ratchet strap, that are all in plane. So if you press down, you can't rock and get that sound. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So that says that this tube, and this tube are all in the same plane with the center lines being. So if there was any other forces, there wouldn't have an opportunity for the tubes to shear. So that's what we want. We had talked before a little bit about using a piece of machine block to make sure that the tubes are in the same plane. And we have this junction right here. So you can see where we have tubes that are aligning with the other tubes that we've already placed. Now we know that those tubes are placed appropriately. They've been gapped and measured to make sure they're straight. So now we want this tube that's not tacked in place to align perfectly with that tube. And then we want to make sure that this tube and this tube remain in plane. So little trick, it's just a piece of 1.5 by 1.5 angle iron. You can take a notch out of the front, and then if you use that to place it over and saddle a junction like that, you can get them on there, and then we can use clamps to make sure that these are good. So Angel, if you want to do that front one.
As far as the process to move forward with getting the cage as assembled and welded as much as we can, it's good to do it in the car as much as you can comfortably. So I'm going to say at this point, we do as much of the welding process in the car as makes sense, and then anywhere that we don't want to put a weld, I'll put multiple tack welds. So before anything gets welded on a round tube junction, it may have anywhere from 6 to 10 small tack welds. I don't tack weld things once or twice. It's a good thing to be able to put more material in there. It helps with heat transfer. It helps with minimal warping. And then I'll go through and I'll do as much of a first pass on a tube junction as I can with the TIG welding. When the cage eventually gets removed, we can finish the rest of the first pass and then move into the second pass of the TIG welding. You want to do as much as you can in the Jeep because they're landed and set in foundation, so nothing's going to move. But we do have that process where we don't want to weld out of position or upside down if you don't necessarily have to. So there's an opportunity when the cage is still in the Jeep to get as much of that laid out as you can, and then everything needs braced up with some just scrap material so that things don't want to wander on you through the welding process.
With a tube junction like this, there's a couple of things that you want to look for. And the kit, this particular kit, was designed really well in terms of how the tubes come together, where if you didn't do any of these instructional points, you'd probably still be okay, but that's not the goal here. We're trying to make it as good as we can. So it's very important that all of the tubes in a union like this all point at the same point. So what we've done here is, prior to installing this horizontal seatbelt bar, we've measured the halfway point, which is this center punch here, and then we verified it with the center line from the tube above. And then nothing in these is ever truly plumb or level, but they should match. So the angle of this bar with the angle of the seat belt bar is the same. We've marked center line on this center tube, which is right there. I don't know if you can pick that up on the camera, but it's right there. And then if you want to, you can put a little dot on it, right? That tells us that's the center of where all these go. Now, how do you figure out if it's truly going there? Because if this tube is not pointing directly at that, it's off or it's down, in a rollover or a crash or whatever it may be, it creates an opportunity for the forces to not get distributed equally. So if you take a hit over here and this isn't right there, welded appropriately, butted up against that tube as it should be, you create a shear point, and that's where cages can fail. So how do you know if you've got it there? So as mentioned before, we did use some of that aluminum stock to make sure that everything is tied together on the same plane. And then if you were to, we'll call this like a line transfer. We did this in the construction and installation phase of things, but this is just like more instructional and how we get it done. So if we do one there, and then we do one there, and then because we use that aluminum flat stock to make sure that both of these bars are on the same plane, if you take any sort of a straight edge and you give them a rub. Now when you give them a rub, it's going to tell you where the top face of that tube is. So what we've done there is we have one line. It's pointing directly at the center of the tube. So we know that when we've done the construction and installation, that just for this top section, we have two tubes that have been clamped together on the same plane. They've been tack welded in place and positioned so that the center line of the tube is at the center of your landing tube. That way the tubes have been installed correctly, and the geometry is right for distribution of forces, and everything was installed correctly.
From there, the cage is removed, it's put on the rotisserie, and then that helps with not having to weld out of position. The cage can't come out unless the B-pillar is removed. So we had to pause, kind of pump the brake on cage assembly and welding, and then move into completing the B-pillar chop. That gets cut into which was a little bit difficult, but we were able to overcome some challenges there with a couple different types of saws. B-pillar comes off, cage can come out because the B-pillar chop is down, and we know where that needs to land back in.